I think we'll go ahead and get started, Stephen. Welcome to the Alden Kindred's presentation of the funerals of John and Priscilla Alden, burials in Plymouth Colony. My name is Desiree Mobed, and I'm the executive director. The Alden Kindred preserves and shares the legacy of Mayflower passengers John and Priscilla Alden at their homestead in Duxbury, Massachusetts, through guided tours, educational programs, and genealogical research. I'd like to offer a special welcome to our members who are joining us today, whose support helps make programs like this possible. Today, we are very honored to welcome Stephen C. O'Neill, whose deep knowledge and scholarship promise a fascinating exploration of burial and funeral practices in the Pilgrim world. Stephen is a distinguished historian, curator, and author, widely recognized for his expertise on 17th century life in Plymouth Colony. He currently serves as director of the Dyer Memorial Library and executive director of the Hanover Historical Society. Stephen was the guest curator for the Alden House when he created a fabulous exhibit of the archaeological artifacts from the 17th century home site of John and Priscilla Alden. This exhibit, which is displayed at the Alden House, offers a glimpse into the daily lives of this famous Plymouth Colony couple and a window into the rhythms of a colonial household. After the talk, we encourage you to ask questions by typing them into the chat or the question and answer function, and a recording of this program will be posted on the Alden website at alden.org. Thank you again for joining, and let's welcome Stephen O'Neill.
Thank you very much, Desiree, for the very kind words and for inviting me to give this talk today. I have been fascinated with burying grounds and cemeteries my whole life. And I've had the great privilege to lead many tours of burying grounds, cemeteries, giving talks on burial and funeral customs. And there's always more to learn. There's such incredible stories in every burial ground, cemetery, and how people mourned throughout the centuries. So today, we're looking specifically at John and Priscilla Alden. And we'll use those two as a way to sort of understand how funerals were conducted in Plymouth Colony, the differences from today and the similarities. So we'll explore not only how the funeral happened, but why, the reasons behind how people mourned in the 17th century. As you can see from the first photo, the old Puritans here in New England had a bit of a fascination with death. As you go into any old burying ground, and like the ones in Boston, Copp's Hill, the Granary, King's Chapel, you'll see extraordinary gravestones that give a real idea of what the 17th century was like. So, to begin with, it was Monday, September 12th, when John Alden passed away at his home in Duxbury. That is old style calendar, the old Julian calendar. So you have to add a couple of dates to update it. But this record comes from the diary of Samuel Sewall, who was a judge and magistrate up in Boston. He recorded in his diary, Monday, September 12th, Mr. John Alden, the ancient magistrate of Plymouth, died. It's very fortunate that old Judge Sewall wrote this down in his diary, because besides this record, there really is no other record of when Alden passed away. And that is very true for Priscilla. We have really no idea when she died. We only know that she predeceased her husband, John, because she was no longer mentioned. This is common for 17th century Plymouth. Many of the colonists, their death dates are not known. And this is true for a lot of people, men and women. The most extraordinary case is Elizabeth White Winslow, who was the wife of one governor and the mother of another governor, and we have no idea when she passed away. Resolved White, another Mayflower passenger, we have no idea when he died either, or where he was buried. This is true for most of them, because as we'll see, not everybody had their graves marked by gravestones. People find this rather hard to understand nowadays, but gravestones were expensive. And at the time, not many people could afford them or had the resources to have one erected. But for John, when he passed away, that September 12th, 1687, his body was taken care of by the family or a few neighbors. He died in his own home. He died and it affected the community. So neighbors and friends would come together. The body would be treated, cleaned, washed. He wouldn't be buried in any of his clothes because the clothes were too valuable to be buried. So he'd be wrapped in a long winding sheet, tied at the head and at the feet. Some flowers would be applied or herbs to cover any bad smells. A coffin would be made out of wood, custom made by either a family member or a neighbor. And the whole community would process from the house with the coffin to the burying ground. The grave would be dug 6 feet deep. The body would be lowered in with ropes, and then the grave would be covered. Family and friends would then gather at somebody's house to share food and drinks. Prayers were few. Funeral sermons were rare at this time. The whole affair was very simple, far different from a lot of the more elaborate funerals that we might be familiar with today. But it was a ritual that had special meaning for many of the colonists here in New England. And it's that ritual that is so fascinating. So for John and Priscilla, their funerals were simple affairs, but they do have elements of that ritual that show what their society was like, what their beliefs were. It's extraordinary how the Puritans here in New England devoted so much time thinking about death and so much effort in considering how funerals should occur. The old burying ground in Duxbury is one of the finest little burying grounds in Plymouth, in the old Plymouth colony area. It was the site of the first meeting house, and the second meeting house was just a little bit off to one side. There are a number of early 18th century stones there, including a wonderful stone for the Reverend Ichabod Wiswall, who just has a wonderful name as well. The Aldens did not have their graves marked as we would think of them, with a carved gravestone. There are many reasons for this, which we will explore. But their graves have been marked since the 1930s, when these two memorial markers were erected by the Alden kindred. They are located in one corner of the old burying ground where there are other generations of Aldens. This old burying ground was used up until the 1780s, when the Mayflower Cemetery was created just a couple miles away. After that, this old burying ground, like many others, sort of fell into benign neglect. There are stories it was used as a cow pasture. This occurred in many places. As meeting houses moved locations, a lot of the oldest burying grounds were sort of left off on by the wayside. The old burying ground in Duxbury the Winslow burying ground over in Marshfield, the Men of Kent burying ground up in Scituate are some of these more important old burying grounds. So for Alden, of course, it's extraordinary that he lived to 1687. He was the last survivor who signed the Mayflower Compact. He wasn't the last of the Mayflower passengers. There were several of the children who came over who lived into the 1690s. The last survivor was Mary Allerton, who died in 1699. But all of them were Calvinists, and their beliefs influenced not only how they were buried, but the burying ground and the material culture that surrounds them. Samuel Fuller, John Alden's fellow Mayflower passenger, wrote in his will, 1633, I, Samuel Fuller the elder, bequeath my soul to God and my body to the earth until the resurrection. In many of the wills from the 17th century New England, you find the phrase, I commit my soul to God and my body to decent burial. That's the key phrase, decent burial. And when you think about it, it's rather extraordinary because these are Calvinists. These are followers of the Reformed tradition of Christianity. John Calvin, of course, is the leading figure in their practice of Christianity. And John Calvin wrote that the souls of the faithful, after completing their term of combat and travail, are gathered into rest, where they await with joy the fruition of their promised glory. And thus all things remain in suspense until Jesus Christ appears as the Redeemer. For Calvinists, everything was predetermined by God. So you were never sure if you were one of the elect. You were never sure if you were a visible saint. And you were never sure of going to heaven. Calvinism taught the utter depravity of the human soul. And unlike Roman Catholicism, with its funeral masses, prayers for the dead, the Reformed Protestants did not want anything like that. There was nothing you could do or say that would help the person who has just died. So prayers at the side of the grave were useless. They are taught as from children that they will one day die. And it becomes sort of a background to their entire life. And these being, of course, good Puritans, they really went overboard with this idea. One English Puritan minister wrote, Thy body, when the soul is gone, will be a horror to all that behold it, a most loathsome and abhorred spectacle. Those that loved it most cannot now find it in their hearts to look on it, by reason of the griefly deformedness which death will put upon it. Down into a pit. And he gets rather gruesome, but he finishes by saying, when the soul departs this life, it carries nothing away with it but grace, God's favor, and a good conscience. So this idea that you were never sure if you were one of the elect, if you were a visible saint, was with all these Puritans when they emigrated to New England. It's a powerful force, thinking of your life as a pilgrimage, as a journey, like the language that they used describing not only their voyage across the Atlantic in physical ships, but also their lives. And when they came to New England, of course, they encountered Native Americans. The Wampanoags, the Massachusetts, the Nipmucks, all the other nations here had their own funeral customs. Many of them um, had a few similarities to European customs. Roger Williams, in his Key into the Language, in which he translates many phrases from the native language, talks about their mourning, and it is the word sikotoi. He is in black, meaning he is in mourning. It's funny that black was a similar color to choose for mourning as Europeans. And you can see the men, as the English, wear black faces with soot very thick. But what's interesting is for Native Americans, unlike Europeans, they're not buried lying straight in a line. Native people have been discovered buried in sort of a curled up position, almost like a fetal position, and usually on their sides. It's thought it's a symbolic return to the womb, a symbolic return to Mother Earth. In 1832, the famous skeleton in armor was discovered in Fall River, and it was found with pieces of metal all over it. So at the time, people thought, well, it must be a Viking, it must be a European. But given the way the body was found, it was most likely a 17th century contact period burial. But the native people had used trade metal for their own purposes. They cut up bits of pots or other metal tools and created their own adornments for the body. Burrs Hill, the 17th century burying ground over in Bristol, Rhode Island, Bristol Warren, Rhode Island, that area. Bodies were found with personal items. They were covered in reed mats. The bodies were painted red, different colors, and positioned with the arms close in and the knees drawn up. So there's this interesting sort of parallel burial custom going on among Native people when the Pilgrims have arrived. Of course, famously, Coles Hill was the first burying ground, the first winter. And according to legends later that developed later, they were buried at night so that the natives didn't know how many had died. But more likely, Coles Hill, as you notice when you stand there, it's right next to the water. It's right next to the landing. Most of the people that first winter are living on board the ship when the house is being built. So if you have a dead body, it's easy to find the nearest hill and bury the people there. And it, of course, is winter, so it gets dark fairly early. One of the sort of interesting features that people often overlook is most burials took place sort of in the late afternoon. This is a tradition that continued into the 19th century. So here is the list of the people who died that first winter that are most likely buried up on Coles Hill, and you can see the sarcophagus there. Thomas Prince, the 18th century minister and historian, copied a chronology, the original of which has since been lost, and lists out a lot of the dates of when these people died that first winter, including the darkest period of February, when they were dying fairly quickly. Coles Hill is, of course, borne out as the first burying ground because the remains have been uncovered over the years. Some have washed out, some have been dug up, all between 1735 and 1883. Craig Chartier created this wonderful little diagram here that shows some of the locations of where those burials were found. And the remains that have been uncovered there were photographed and then replaced in that big sarcophagus for the 1920 tercentenary. Now, what's important to note is that these are English burials because the bodies were discovered lying straight. They were not curled up. So that's how we know the difference between the native and English burials. Our beloved Burial Hill in Plymouth. Burial Hill is truly one of the most extraordinary burying grounds in all of New England for its history, its location, the types of stones, the people buried there. It is truly remarkable. I've had the great privilege of leading many tours up there, and every single time there's always more to discover. Burial Hill, of course, was chosen as not only the highest point in town, the location of the fort, but as the burying ground. My contention is it was chosen in the spring of 1621. William Bradford wrote that Governor Carver died after the Mayflower had returned to England. But unlike those burials during the winter and the people who were buried on Coles Hill, Bradford records that he was buried in the best manner they could, with some volleys of shot, and then his wife was buried with him 5 or 6 weeks later. My feeling is by this time they've built the fort up on the hill, or they're building a fort up on the hill. They've chosen this as the location for public land. So, and a hill is not as valuable as flat land for farming or for building homes. So, hills were most often chosen as the locations for burying grounds. You see this in Copp's Hill in Boston, in the North End. You see this in Old Burial Hill in Marblehead. And you see this happening over and over. And remember, they're not worried about a hearse driving up there. They're carrying bodies by hand. So, yes, it's difficult to go uphill, but these were the locations most often chosen. So, what happened? When John Alden died that September 12th, 1687, there was no undertakers. Funeral homes were a century and a half away. The body would be taken care of by the family, or a neighbor might come over to help. Men and women would have their clothes saved. Like I said, clothes were too valuable and too expensive to bury with somebody. So the body would be washed and cleaned and carefully wrapped in a winding sheet. This image here is from a broadside printed in London in 1604, and you can see exactly how the body would be wrapped. Tied at the head and tied at the feet. It's usually one long cloth that wraps around so that it could be opened to view the face. Now, medical science being what it was in the 17th century, there would be a wake sitting with the body, making sure the person is really dead. Similar to wakes today, where you spend time, watching the body, but also a chance to say goodbye. Flowers or herbs would be placed inside the folds of the winding sheet. That would mask any smells. And one of the interesting things is bodies were not embalmed. That was extremely rare, although not uncommon. Back in England in the 17th century, the Puritans of the Commonwealth period did prohibit embalming. Remember, they wanted burials very quickly, very simple. Embalming is a technique where the active fluids and soft tissues are removed from the body, replaced with inert materials. If you don't embalm a body, the chemicals keep working. If you've ever seen, an animal on the side of the road that's been struck, after a few days, if it's left out, it will start to swell because the chemicals keep working. So to prevent that, that's what embalming does. So bodies had to be buried fairly quickly. Funerals would take place within a day or so. A winding sheet would be used to wrap the body. These little fragments here are pieces dug up from the grave of Miles Standish. Old Captain Standish was dug up in the 1890s, once or twice more, to make sure the location. And when Standish died in 1657, or 56, I'm sorry, he left in his will that he wanted to be buried near the bodies of his daughter Laura and daughter-in-law Mary. And the body of a male was excavated near the bodies of two young women in the 1890s in the middle of the old burying ground in Duxbury. These little fragments of wool cloth were found near the bodies. And you can see their wool, they're of a couple different types of weave. The one on the left is interesting because it has that little streak of color. It's indigo, which at this time was a relatively new source for colors. Indigo was being imported from some of the southern colonies, like South Carolina. So these pieces of cloth provide a good example of the materials for how the body was treated. These are in the collections of Pilgrim Hall Museum down in Plymouth, and Duxbury Rural and Historical has a few other bits of the cloth as well. The coffin. In the 17th century, coffins looked kind of different from the caskets we bury people in nowadays. This illustration shows the sort of gable-lidded coffin that were common in the 17th century in England and other parts of Europe. They're gable-lidded, so they're sort of like a small little house model that's been stretched out. It's wider at the head and narrower at the feet. There are other types of coffins, the hexagonal shape, but this is one of the easiest ones to make. Just like the treatment of the body, the coffin is made by a family member or by a neighbor who is a woodworker. There were house wrights, joiners, turners. Some of the earliest records for coffins appear in the 1630s, 1633. Kenelm Winslow, the brother of Governor Edward Winslow, is recorded as being paid for coffins for people who die from disease. Coffins are an expense, so some of the earliest burials may not have had them, but by the 1630s and 40s, these types of coffins had become popular. And this is the sort of coffin that John Alden and Priscilla would have been buried in. And one thing is interesting, a coffin. We, if you go to the funeral home nowadays, call them caskets. Casket is a term that came in the 19th century when there was a bit of a softening in the attitudes towards death. A casket originally meant a jewel box, a small little treasure chest. But the coffin is the raw box that a person is buried in. There's a lot of those changes that occur in attitudes towards death, and you can see that in many of the burying grounds throughout New England. Boom. The probate of Peter Brown, 1633, the estate sells, when it's settled, item to Kenelm Winslow for a coffin, 12 pence. Or 12 shillings, I'm sorry. This coffin fragment here comes from Governor Bradford's coffin. It was picked up by old Dr. James Thatcher in 1835 when they were erecting the monument for Governor Bradford up at the top of Burial Hill. It's just a little knot of wood, but certainly might have come from the coffin of Governor Bradford. The coffins were made of pine, most likely. Sometimes they would be decorated, painted black. Sometimes tacks would be used, little brass tacks would be used to put initials on it. The shape of the coffin with that gable lid is borne out in a lot of graves that have been excavated throughout the colonies, because in some of the burials where the coffin collapses over time, a line of rust right down the middle of the body shows where the nails held the top of the coffin, the peak, together. This has been discovered in Virginia and Maryland, as well as up here. Graves, by law, had to be dug 6 feet deep, and they're dug by hand. It is still a little interesting how they would have buried in a really cold winter when the ground is frozen. It wasn't until later that receiving tombs were created, but most often it was a couple people paid for the digging of the grave. And you see that in a lot of the probate records. The funeral itself is an interesting sort of public ritual. At burials, nothing is read, wrote Thomas Letchford about Boston in the 1630s, nor any funeral sermon made, but all the neighborhood or a good company come together, and they carry the dead solemnly to his grave, and there stand by him while he is buried. The ministers are most commonly present. And here you can see this image here. It is from 1666, and it shows a funeral procession at the time of the Great Plague in London. And it says, burying the dead with a bell before them. Not every town could afford a church bell, but those that did have them, the tolling of the bell would call people together for the funeral. This developed into a whole ritual that up until the early 19th century continued throughout New England. A certain number of rings of the bell would be for a man, a certain number for a woman, a certain number for a child. And that occurred up until the 1830s. Otherwise, you'd be drawn together with a drum. People would assemble at the home where the body was placed in the coffin, and then process to the meeting house and or the burial ground. Sometimes the coffin would be put on a couple little stools in the center of the meeting house or off to one side. By the 1680s, funeral prayers and sermons were beginning to happen throughout New England. It was more common in Boston, but chances are John, his body, would be brought to the meeting house, which was right next to the burying ground. The minister would say a prayer, offer a service, and offer a sermon, and then process to the burying ground. Here you can see a detail from a funeral broadside in which it shows a detail from the funeral broadside for Major Thomas Leonard of Taunton in 1713. It's based on an earlier engraving, but you can see the people following the coffin. Some of the churches at this time had bought palls, a funeral pall, which was basically a big cloth. In some more elaborate funerals, you would have people carry the coffin, and then you would have the pall bearers actually carry the cloth over the coffin during the procession. People were invited to funerals, oftentimes receiving gifts of rings with little skulls on them, sometimes scarves, spoons. They would wear black or otherwise other items of clothing to show that they were in mourning. Places like Duxbury, a little bit more rural, the funeral would have been a much simpler affair. By the time of 1687, chances are when the funeral procession for John Alden reached the grave, which had already been dug ahead of time, he would have been placed in there and covered over. The minister may have said a prayer, but we don't know for certain. One of the frustrating aspects of all of this is how little evidence there is, eyewitness evidence, for these funerals. But by 1687, something else fairly interesting is happening. Funeral elegies are starting to appear. And this is a new development that goes against, sort of the fashions for the previous several decades. The Directory for the Public Worship of God, printed by the Westminster Convention of 1645, ordered that when any person departeth this life, let the dead body upon the day of burial be decently buried, or decently attended from the house to the place appointed for public burial, and there immediately interred without any ceremony. But burials and funerals were important, particularly for the New Englanders. So they started to take on a lot of new elements. In addition to the gifts of rings, particularly for ministers, or other items like that, funeral elegies start to appear. These were most often written by a minister or other leader in the community. This one here is actually an 1806 reprint of an original from 1687, written and published for John Alden. This is it's a small, just over 8.5 by 11 piece of paper, but it reprints an original elegy. And this one, upon the death of that aged, pious, sincere-hearted Christian, John Alden, Esquire, was written by Reverend John Cotton, the minister of Plymouth First Church. What's extraordinary is John Alden had two of these. One, we know, upon the death of that aged, pious, sincere Christian, was written by Reverend John Cotton. The other one was written by an anonymous person. And funeral elegies are broadsides. So they're printed up on one side, and they're meant to be either tacked up in the meeting house door, or during funerals, Samuel Sewell and others like Cotton Mather record that they were sometimes affixed to the coffin themselves, as they were brought through on procession. Now, the broadside written by John Cotton, reads, "Upon the death of that aged, pious, sincere-hearted Christian, John Alden, Esquire, late magistrate of New Plymouth Colony, who died September the 12th, 1687, being about 89 years of age." The elegies take the form of poems, 17th century religious poems. There are dozens of these elegies written and published. Many of them are extant. There's only a couple copies of the ones for Alden that still exist. The poetry is not great. It's not near the quality of, say, Anne Bradstreet with her wonderful images of Puritan life, but they do come out of the same tradition. John Cotton, in his elegy, writes that Alden came one of the first into this land, and here was kept by God's most gracious hand years 67, which time he did behold to poor New England's mercies manifold. And he goes on to write, for Alden, his work now finished upon this earth. He lived in Christ, in Jesus now he sleeps. Sleeping is often used as a metaphor for death. Sometimes you see the phrase, fell asleep in Jesus. So it's this idea that the journey is done, and now you are asleep. And he sort of finishes, "Lord, spare thy remnant, do not us forsake," which is a common refrain in a lot of these elegies. The idea that our heroic first generation is no longer with us. And are we living up to their mission? Are we living up to the challenges that God has given us? The other funeral elegy for Alden, a small testimony of that great honor due to that honorable servant of God and his generation, John Alden, Esquire, who changed this life for a better, September 12th, Anno Domini 1687, Annoque Aetatis 89. And this one says Boston 1687, when and where it was printed. This one, too, it has the similar language to John Cotton's. And it begins, God brought a choice vine to this desert land. New England was seen as a wilderness. It was seen as not being cultivated. And so here's this wonderful metaphor of this vine, um, you know, Alden himself being brought to this desert land. He goes on, he many years did serve this colony, administering justice impartially. And now Alden, he with St. Paul, his course now finished, unclothed, is quietly put to bed. There's a wonderful little detail there of how the body was treated. You know, the clothes were removed, and he is now in a winding sheet. And it finishes, and let New England never want a race of such as may be filled with Alden's grace. These are very sort of laudatory poems, very much going against that idea that, well, why are we offering these prayers when, it's all predetermined? And this is part of the sort of change over time that occurs with a lot of New Englanders. The idea of the declension in Puritanism, in the original religious fervor that brought, the early colonists to New England. These are pages from Nathaniel Morton's New England's Memorial, which much of it is copied from Bradford's History of Plymouth Plantation, but Morton spends history really just sort of eulogizing the people who have died. He talks about in 1656 here that this year Captain Miles Standish expired his mortal life, and gives some of the details. He came over into New England with such of them as at the first set out for the planting of the plantation of New Plymouth, and bear a deep share of their first difficulties. This is a common refrain in a lot of the histories that are being written. You find this in the works of Cotton Mather, of Increase Mather, the sermons. They're altering their original sort of form of how you remember the dead. And by the 1690s, 17 teens and 20s, like I said, that ritual has become much more elaborate. This is also seen in how graves are marked. Here you see a photo of Miles Standish's grave before he was dug up. You go to the old burying ground now, and you'll see, a large monument with cannon marking his grave. But Standish, when he died in 1656, he was the military captain for Plymouth Colony, so he was an important figure. And his grave was marked literally with just a couple triangular-shaped field stones. And that's where the body was found when it was excavated and exhumed in the 1890s. The other picture shows some fieldstone grave markers over at the Winslow burying ground, which has really never been touched by 19th century sextons. Pairs of fieldstones marked off original graves. Judge Sewell, in his diary, remarks that in 1680s, he was down in Barnstable and he went to see the grave of Reverend Wally, who had passed away in the 1670s. And he saw the, quote, coffin rail all tumbled about. The earliest graves would be marked either with field stones or with a little couple of wooden posts with some cross stretches, like a small fence, a coffin rail. Maybe the name and year of the deceased person would have been painted onto it. A couple of pieces of wood standing out in a New England field for a couple of years is not going to last. The field stones, a lot of them in the 19th century, when a lot of burying grounds were improved, so-called by sextons, or changed. A lot of these old stones might have been moved, but those field stones gave way to carved stones. And here we see one of the oldest dated gravestones in all Plymouth Colony area. It's actually over in the Newman Hunt Cemetery in East Providence. And it's the WC stone. And it's dated very simply WC 1659. And it's most likely from William Carpenter, who died that year. And here you see the gravestone for William Patty. He was an early inhabitant of Plymouth Colony. He came in the 1630s, but later moved up to Boston. And this stone is extraordinary because it's a small green slate, very sort of thick stone. And it says, here lies the body of William Patty, age 58 years, departed this life August 1658. His footstone says it was erected 1672. So that's quite a length of time, over a decade between the time Patty had died and his grave was marked. And that's common. Gravestones took a while to be carved and then to be erected. And the interesting thing about this one as well is the stone was found under the foundation of the old State House in 1830 when they were doing work. Gravestones often disappeared out of old burying grounds. And there are many, many stories of old gravestones being used for walkways, foundation stones, flagstones, sewer covers. There's many stories like that. Thomas Willett, a leading figure of Plymouth Colony, has this gravestone, 1674. It's a similar type to the one for William Patty, and this is over in Riverside Cemetery, East Providence. You can see this wonderful bedboard shape, 1674. Here lies the body of that worthy Willett. Kind of a fun script, but notice there's no imagery. It's just the epitaph. For gravestones, when they started to be carved up in Boston, 1670s and 80s, they couldn't have any sort of Roman Catholic images. No crosses, no Sacred Hearts of Jesus, no Paschal Lambs, nothing that was too Catholic. So they went with basic old medieval images and Renaissance images of death, of mourning, and of passing time. Things like an hourglass, a skull, a cut flower. The idea the flower is beautiful, but it is cut and will soon die. And images of mortality. This is one of the most important gravestones of the 17th century here in New England. This is for Phineas Pratt. Pratt had arrived in Plymouth Colony originally on the Sparrow heading to Wessagusset, now Weymouth, back in 1622, and then was a resident of Plymouth and then moved up to Charlestown. And he has this wonderful gravestone carved by the anonymous gravestone carver of Boston, the stonecutter, or the Charlestown carver. And you can see this is the winged skull, very realistic. It has sayings in Latin, fugit hora. It has the hourglass. It has crossed bones with that little coffin shape, the hexagonal shape. And it has the crossed pickaxe and shovel. All images of mortality, all images of passing time. The skull there with the wings is an image of the soul, old Phineas's soul, after death, but before judgment. So the wings give the impression of heading up towards heaven, but the skull is a really sort of raw image. And it indicates that we're not sure if he's really saved or not. We're hopeful he is, but only God has that power to decide. And when you bought a stone, you had this sort of bedboard shape. This would be the headstone. There would be a smaller footstone. Literally, it would mark out the grave, the size of the grave. The face, the epitaph of the headstone often faces west. About 80% of all pre-1800 gravestones in New England face west because you want to be able to sit up and face east on the day of resurrection, facing towards Jerusalem where the Messiah will reappear. It's an interesting little detail that gives you an idea of how the old colonists viewed death. Here we see some gravestones for some of the other original Plymouth colonists, there are only 3 original gravestones for any of the passengers of the first 4 ships, outside of our buddy Phineas there. The gravestone for Richard Moore, who was 5 years old on the Mayflower. He dies around 1694 to 6, but it says, "Here lieth buried the body of Captain Richard Moore, aged 84 years, died 1692, a Mayflower pilgrim." Those last 2 lines were added in the late 19th century. So the original stone was a very simple little affair, very simple little grave marker. The one for Thomas Clark, who came over on the Anne and Little James, died in 1697, and that's a much more interesting stone because it has that wonderful shield shape in the epitaph, and it has the cherub face. Winged skulls or winged cherub faces were soul effigies, images of the soul. The only other original gravestone is this one for Thomas Cushman. Thomas Cushman came on the Fortune when he was 14 years old, and he is buried with his wife, Mary Allerton Cushman. Mary Allerton came on the Mayflower in 1620 when she was 5. And you can see in the church records, it records that the gravestones weren't erected until, paid for and put in place until 1715, almost a quarter century after Cushman died in 1691. And here you can see a winged skull with some ornamentation down the sides, fruits, vines, flowers. There's a whole iconography on the old gravestones. For Alden's family, his son Jonathan, who inherits the Alden house, has this tiny little stone. It dates from 1697. This stone itself was found fallen over in the burying ground back in the 19th century and spent several decades in a front parlor in a house in Duxbury before being returned to the graveyard in the 1890s. And on the other side is the gravestone for Captain John Alden. These are both the sons of John and Priscilla. He dies in 1701 up in Boston. His gravestone was found in the bell tower of the Old South Meeting House in the 19th century, and then it is put up on the wall of the entryway of the New Old South Church in Copley Square. Like I said, some of the gravestones kind of walked every once in a while. But these are the stones that mark off some of the second generation. Chances are Captain John made arrangements for the small gravestone for his younger brother, who predeceased him. Boston-made stones appear in several of the old burying grounds, but not until the 1690s in Plymouth Colony. The oldest one I've seen carved gravestone in the area is 1689 for a Bostonian who came and is buried in Norwell. This is the gravestone for Elizabeth Alden Pabody, who is buried down in Little Compton. And here you can see a Rhode Island version of the winged skull with the wonderful flowers and leaves on the side and wonderful little rosettes. And then the graves of our friends John and Priscilla were finally marked by the Alden kindred in 1930. These reproduction gravestones were erected among their descendants. The burying ground probably has several hundred people buried within its boundaries, but there's very few gravestones to mark original graves, and most of them are 18th century. So I understand that these markers are about to be restored thanks to the efforts of some nice people in Duxbury and some CPC funds. It's important that we mark these graves. It's important that we remember how they were buried, where they were buried, and why. So that is my presentation today. If I will be happy to answer a few questions if I can.
Thank you, Stephen. That was absolutely wonderful. And we do have several questions for you. Some were submitted before your talk as well. So um, one of the questions has to do with sort of mourning rituals, and that is, have you ever come across sort of, understand, was there a period of mourning that was understood or respected in that earlier time period of the 17th century New England and John and Priscilla's world? That would there be like, was it a month, 6 weeks? Um, what do you think?
That's a really interesting question. We think of 19th and 20th century, the older mourning customs, even to the point where, um, people may remember some, grandparents wearing a black armband, to show you were in mourning. For the 17th century, I don't think there was any, not that I've come across, any prescribed amount of time, a day, a week, a month, or whatever. Um, it's not to say people wouldn't be in mourning for a while, but I don't think it was as much of an issue as it became later in the 19th century.
And another question comes in from Kathleen, and that is, I understand Mary Chilton lived with the family after her father died. I'm not sure which family she's talking about, but it would have been certainly a family. How close did she become with John and Priscilla? And did she attend the funeral? I assume that meant of John. So I don't know if you have any more personal records of Mary Chilton after she got married, and
Um,
could provide information along that line.
I'm not sure. Mary Chilton, of course, married John Winslow, the brother of Governor Edward Winslow, and they moved up to Boston. And their burials, most likely took place in the old King's Chapel burying ground, the oldest burying ground up in Boston, right there on Tremont Street. Um, I don't know if she would have attended John or Priscilla's funerals. Um, One of the difficulties is the funeral would have had to have taken place within the space of 2 to 3 days at most. Um, Even in September, we've got a wonderful warm day like today. So funerals had to take place quickly, and travel being what it is, news being what it is, there just may not have been time or the opportunity for a lot of people to attend the burial. So it'd be nice to think maybe she had come down, others had come down from Boston, um, but there's no way of really knowing without a firsthand account.
And another question about burial sites outside of a meeting house graveyard. So I think the information about the Duxbury meeting house was that there's evidence of it by 16, I believe, 38, when there's an incident that actually references the building of the meeting house. But those graves of people that were in Duxbury, let's say like Peter Brown, who died 1633, or before the meeting house was built, would they have been buried in Duxbury on private land or back in Plymouth, do you think?
That is one of the issues that really sort of is a fascinating aspect. A lot of the older histories from the 19th century said, oh, well, everybody was buried on their own property. That was rarely the case. Most often, when a town is established, a burying ground is laid out just like the space for a training green, just like a public space for the meeting house. Burial grounds, um, and obviously the term burial ground, burying place, burial place, were the immediate terms used. Cemetery, which means city of sleepers, does not come in until the 19th century. But a burial ground would be laid out as soon as the town is being divided up into property. and it's strictly secular. Back in Europe, Catholics had to be buried in consecrated ground that was blessed. And so long as the bones and remains stayed in that consecrated ground, you were okay. One of the worst punishments in old medieval Catholic Europe was to be buried in unconsecrated ground. But here, burial grounds were strictly secular. There was no blessing by the minister. So usually it was just for convenience sake that the burying ground and meeting house were next to each other. But as is often the case, the meeting house was later moved to a different location. As for the early ones, that burying ground was almost definitely marked off by the time of Duxbury's establishment in 1637. 37, right? Um,
30. Yeah.
so, yeah, it would have been laid out as a general area. And, if you think of other places, a lot of times they're on the town common. If you ever go down to New Haven, the original burying ground was just one section of the town common. So if they died before 1637, it's unclear, but they might have been buried there in Duxbury as the people were already moving over to that area and establishing, their own little congregation.
So we did get a question from Jennifer about a map of the location of the old burial grounds. And Jennifer, yes, there is one I know for the Duxbury Standish site that was created just of the stones that are still there. And that was created by an Eagle Scout several years ago. I think you can access that on the website. If not, you can get it through the Duxbury Town Cemetery office or here at the Alden House. We have one as well. I don't know if there is a map of the burial sites at the burial ground in Plymouth. I know Stephen would certainly know that since he has done so many tours over there.
Yes, there are a couple of older maps from the 19th century of Burial Hill that mark off a lot of the more famous graves, like Governor Bradford, the Cushmans, our beloved General James and Mercy Otis Warren. But there's also some online resources that the town of Plymouth has created where they have created digital maps, which can be used to look up various gravestones. Burial Hill is extraordinarily crowded, but it's online. I believe it's through the town and a couple others groups like the Friends of Burial Hill that have created those maps.
Thank you. And a question from Connor about the possibility, since, Standish has been dug, his gravesite has been dug a few times. Is it possible that there's enough information that his face could be created using some of the wonderful modern technology?
I don't know. I've seen a couple of photos of the bones and the remains. It's I don't know if there's enough to recreate his face. I do remember that when Captain Standish was dug up, some of his descendants were there, and I remember that the skull was held next to the one of his descendants to find any similarities, which is kind of funny. But I don't know if there's enough images of the skull to recreate his face. That'd be interesting.
And a question about John Cotton. What was he related to Cotton Mather?
Yeah, a cousin or so. Uh, Reverend John Cotton of Plymouth was the son of the Reverend John Cotton of Boston, one of the original ministers, Puritan ministers. And he was our John Cotton here was the minister of Plymouth from the 1660s into the 1690s. I forget the exact relation to Cotton Mather. I want to say a cousin, because all the sort of Puritan minister families sort of intermarried at the time.
And I just wanted to let you know, Stephen, that we have been joined today by people from England up to Canada, down to Florida, and across the country to Oregon. So a very interested group, but also questions about whether or not there is actually a book that discusses the Pilgrim, the Mayflower Pilgrim grave sites and specifically focused on that history. And if not, perhaps that is on your list of future projects.
I do have about 75% of a book written about the graves of the people of Plymouth Colony. I did a study when I was in graduate school of there's roughly about 250 people who arrived on the first four ships, the Mayflower, Fortune, and a Little James. And I tried locating as best I could, their dates of death, their locations, whether they had gravestones, what is known about their funerals. So hopefully, once I get through a couple other projects, I'd love to turn that into a well-illustrated, researched, and well-written book looking at all the sort of pilgrim grave sites and make it a really good study of all these customs and how and why they were buried.
Thank you, Stephen. I know that would be very well received. I would certainly like to add that when you did the archaeology exhibit at the Alden House, we have a wonderful catalog of those featuring some of those standout pieces, and it's certainly a wonderful resource. And as we are, I know just past 9, I want to be respectful, 1 o'clock, I want to be respectful of everyone's time. I want to thank you all for joining. A recording of this talk will be posted on the Alden website. Stephen, I think there were a couple of requests for photos from your presentation. Perhaps that's an opportunity to get some of those photos through the recording. And I want to give anyone a last chance if there are any last questions. Otherwise, we'll go ahead and wrap this up. And I want to thank you all for visiting this program. Stephen, thank you for your wonderful presentation. And as always, it's always a delight to listen to you and to hear all the things that you can share about the 17th century. So I want to wish everyone a wonderful afternoon and weekend, and please look at our website, alden.org, for future talks and events. Thank you very much.
Thank you.